So our next session is a panel on fertility, and it's the steep decline in global fertility causes and consequences, although Claudia's title is also very good because it describes it. So we're pleased to have four panelists. Michael Geruso will go first, and then Claudia Goldin will go second. Jeanne Lafortune will be third, and then Jesus Fernandez-Villaverde will be fourth. And they'll talk about various aspects of the causes and consequences of the decline in fertility. They'll start with 12 to 15-minute opening statements, and then we'll bring everybody up. We're going to swivel the table up, and then we'll have a general back and forth, and I'll be the moderator. Let me just leave you with two facts. They're going to give you many more, I'm sure, but just to think about, and some of them particularly with respect to the session we just had on geoeconomics. So first of all, if you look at the census projections, if population were determined solely by the U.S. natural rate of increase, the population of the U.S. would start declining in 15 years. Okay, so without immigration, the U.S. population will decline. Now, the second question is, why is China so powerful? Their GDP per capita is only 15% of the US GDP. So why are they so powerful? Well, it's the capita part. Their population is 4 times the US. And so even for the topic we talked about before, population is very, very important. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Geruso.
Hi, I'm Mike Geruso. I'm a professor at UT Austin. I'm a microeconomist. But this topic of global fertility and its decline and the future of sustained low fertility is something I'm very interested in. I have a book forthcoming in a few months with Dean Spears about fertility decline globally and the long-run implications of that. Today, we divided up this panel, so I'm going to start by just laying out some of the facts, and then other panelists will talk about causes and consequences. I'm realizing from a conversation just a minute ago that to orient you all to some of the facts, I should probably define a term that I use all the time, but that maybe we don't all use all the time, which is the total fertility rate. So when we talk about birth rates and we talk about total fertility rates, that's not the number of births that a woman will have over her lifetime that any particular cohort of women experiences. The total fertility rate is aggregating up age-specific fertility rates in the same way that life expectancy aggregates up age-specific mortality rates at a given point in time and a place. Okay, so what are the facts? Today in the US, birth rates, total fertility is 1.6. And let me back up just 1 second and say, the key number here is 2. Below 2, we have exponential population decay. Above 2 TFR, we have population growth. In the US, we have a total fertility rate of 1.6. The birth rate is below 2 in every major subpopulation in the US. So among whites, among blacks, among Hispanics, it's all below replacement. In every state, it's below replacement. If we look at nearby neighbor countries, our adversaries to the north and south, Canada's fertility rate is 1.3. Mexico recently dipped below the US. So Mexico's birth rate, you'd have to go out to a couple significant digits to find it, but the latest statistics are Mexican fertility below the United States. And I know Claudia will give a talk that compares fertility rates among a group of rich countries in Europe and Southeast Asia. Europe as a whole, so I'll let her talk about those details, but Europe as a whole is 1.5, Japan 1.2, South Korea, everybody's favorite example of low fertility modern economy, 0.7. Right. But it's not just rich countries, right? So if you look at the middle income world, Russia has the same fertility rate as Massachusetts, 1.4. Brazil is about the US, 1.6. China, which has gotten a lot of attention, not just in trade, but in my neck of the woods for its declining population over the last few years, its birth rate is 1. And just to trace out how the recent attention to the recent peak and decline in population size in China probably understates the importance of this issue. What does a birth rate of 1 mean? It means that the half-life of cohort sizes is 1 generation. So 2 parents, 1 child in the next generation. In the grandchildren generation, then you're talking about a 75% decline in population size over just 2 generations. So I think somehow the attention about when things peak and crest and then begin to decline can sort of undersell how rapidly at a generational level population can change. And I want to convince you that we should probably think it would change globally as well. Okay, so that's the rich world, or some sampling from it, the middle income world. What about the developing world, lower income countries? So India, which was, for many years, beginning in the 1960s, the center of fears about overpopulation, right? It was the main character in Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb, which, on the cover threatened population control or race to oblivion. Birth rates in India today are below 2. And, that's for the country as a whole. If you also dig into surveys of young women and what they plan or hope for their own families, birth rates look in the future like they might be even lower. So even surveying low-income women living in rural villages, people who don't own a cell phone, haven't interfaced with the internet yet, desired family sizes are for like 1 or 2 children. So, that's not to say that birth rates are low exactly everywhere, but 2/3 of people today live in a country with below replacement fertility levels. So where are the exceptions? The exceptions, India's neighbor Pakistan still has birth rates up around 3.5, but Pakistan in the mid-90s was at 6. Sub-Saharan Africa still has birth rates around 4, but Sub-Saharan Africa, in the mid-20th century was around 6. So in the places where fertility is still above replacement, there are places where it's falling. And most projections assume or predict or estimate that in these places, birth rates will continue to fall as they have everywhere else, as development continues, as opportunities expand, as human capital investment opportunities expand, labor markets open up to more people and better jobs. Okay, so that's saying that low fertility is a global phenomenon. It's also a long-run phenomenon, and I think that can be something that is easily missed when we think about the history of population over the past couple hundred years. In 1800, population was less than 1 billion, or right around 1 billion. By 1925, we had doubled to 2 billion. Since then, we've quadrupled to 8 billion. But over this whole time, to the best of anyone's ability to know, given the limited data that we have, birth rates have been falling. There have been blips, there have been baby booms, but the general global trend has been down. So even as populations were soaring, birth rates were falling. And I think that's important, depending on where the conversation goes when we open up the panel discussion in thinking about what's likely to happen in the future, is to begin with the realization that for as long as anyone can measure them, birth rates have been falling down. Okay, so that's the present, that's the past. What should we expect of the future? Unsurprisingly, given the last sentence, we should expect population growth to slow, and then population to, within a few decades, and different projection houses place this in different decades, 2060, 2070, 2080. The UN is the most conservative in this sense. Population will peak and then begin to decline. And that decline could be just as rapid in principle as the climb has been over the last couple of centuries. Okay, so let me just pivot now a little bit to try to take this one step closer to teeing up a discussion about the macroeconomic implications. So other panelists are going to talk in detail about the macroeconomic implications, but fertility rates matter for the macroeconomy in part because they matter for population size, and in part because they matter for the age structure, among other things. So what do we expect to happen to the age structure? Well, as we have fewer and fewer babies and people are living longer and longer, I think we all have a general sense that the age structure in the US and other developed countries, but also in the developing world, is going to tilt towards a higher retiree-heavy population. Right? And so I was looking through projections for the US from the Census Bureau, as well as for the rest of the world from the UN, and just to give a sense, sort of back in the envelope of where that's heading. So the size of the retiree age population relative to the working age population we expect that in the US to increase by about 70% by the end of the century, over the next 75 years. In OECD countries overall, it'll about double. And in the world overall, which is experiencing a more rapid transition from high to low fertility than the US, for example, that old age dependency ratio will increase by almost 2.5 through the end of the century. Now, I want to add one little wrinkle here, which often isn't discussed in these discussions, which is that's not terribly different from what the last 75 years have looked like. So we are in an aging world, but we've been in an aging world for a very long time. So if you calculate that same statistic from 1950 to today, so looking backwards 75 years instead of forward 75 years, the old age dependency ratio in the US has grown by more. It's more than doubled. The old age dependency ratio in OECD countries is more than doubled. It's almost doubled in the developing world. So that aging of the population is not something new. And I say that not because that aging isn't a challenge for growth, for fiscal balances in the future, but because this is not something that's terribly new. We're in a different position than we were in 1950. There doesn't stand a whole half of the economy that is productive and waiting to be educated and employed, standing ready to enter the workforce. That no longer is available to us to weather that challenge. But it is a challenge that we have weathered. And so maybe we can come back to talking about where is growth going to come from in that, given that changing age profile. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of age distributions is just to give a bit more nuance to this question of dependency. Something that I think actually maybe David Weil was the first one to make me aware of this is, the dependency is shifting. It's not necessarily changing wholesale. So dependency is shifting from youth dependency to old age dependency. And of course, there are important differences between old age dependency and youth dependency. But if instead of looking at old age dependency, you look at workers per capita, right? Workers per capita, or what we can know is working age people per capita. Working age people per capita is not changing very much over the coming 75 years. These age pyramids are shifting to being age columns, fewer children, more retirees. But the total number of workers per population size in the US, I was looking at the US Census Bureau projections yesterday, just isn't changing very much. Maybe there's going to be a 10% increase in people per workers by the end of the century, right? And so, I don't have a thesis about exactly what is that going to mean for the US economy, but I think something important to think about in that context is, we do have a dependency challenge, but very much we have a challenge of where the dependency lives, like literally which houses the dependents live in. In a world where we have a lot of youth dependency, those children are living in the same households as the earners. In a world of old age dependency, the sort of social dependency, that's going to require a much bigger government footprint in order to bring resources, even with the same number of workers per capita, to move resources across households. And I guess the last thought that I'll end on here is a teaser for my view, which we can maybe talk about in the panel if folks are interested, which is that there's absolutely no reason to expect an automatic rebound. There are no automatic stabilizers that stand ready to reverse birth rates, to halt birth rates when they hit 2. We know that because they don't halt when they hit 2. And nothing stands ready, no sort of endogenous economic forces that are going to pull birth rates back up when they fall below 2. So I think the world that we're heading towards, unless we make significant, really serious changes to politics, to our economies, to our cultures, is a future of sustained low fertility.
Okay, I think that this can go. Okay, so my talk concerns macroeconomics and fertility, and it's the impact of the macroeconomy on fertility rather than the other way around. And with that, here. Okay. The babies got stuck. Okay. I know they're delivered rather easily. So babies were front and center during the 2024 campaign that all of us would like to forget. And so remember when J.D. Vance famously asked whether a childless cat lady could run the country. More to the point of my talk is why couples and women in societies have had fewer children historically, and why in particular countries and why at particular moments in time. So the reduction in fertility in the period since the 1970s in almost all nations of the world has been, as we just heard, astonishing, and the continued declines in more recent years have been unprecedented. Now, as an economic historian, I'm going to start with a somewhat longer run picture of fertility. And by the time my story will begin in mid-20th century, fertility levels had already greatly declined across Europe and the United States. In the late 19th century, the average woman would have had 4 to 5 live births, but then that figure declined to around 3 in most places. And part of the earlier decrease was because infant mortality had plummeted. The continued decrease was rather non-Malthusian, and it occurred with increased income, we think largely because of the increase in parental time costs, or because of the better control of fertility, but also because of the rather complicated quality-quantity trade-off model. So the main points that I'm going to make will be motivated here with 4 of these countries, Spain and Italy on the one hand, and the UK and Sweden on the other. In the 1960s, Spain and Italy had higher total fertility rates than the UK and Sweden. But by the 1980s, 1990s, Spain and Italy had become what we call lowest low nations. That's below 1.3 total fertility rate. And the UK and Sweden were higher, although not that high, moderately high. And the question that I am going to pose is why this divide occurred. My answer is going to be that countries that develop rapidly and abruptly will later have much lower levels of fertility. Rapid economic growth often rapid economic growth often gives women greater freedoms, but rapid economic change may lead to conflict when men are more influenced by tradition or gain more from it. The driving channel in this model is the speed with which tradition-bound people are catapulted into modernity. So there is a slight problem with this computer. So let me just fix something here. Okay, let me see if I can do this. You can't see the problem, no. Okay, let me see if I can do it this way. Okay, we'll just deal with the problem. Okay. Let me just get some. Never use someone else's computer. Okay. Okay. Even your employer. Okay. Okay. So one portion of these ideas is contained in a thought-provoking article from some time ago called Will the Stork Return to Europe and Japan? So all nations begin with low income and low market-oriented female employment and high fertility as at point A. With economic growth, female employment increases and fertility decreases as at point C. But in some countries, fertility will fall even more, and female employment somewhat paradoxically will not increase that much. And the reason that women in these countries are expected The reason is that women in these countries are expected to do the majority of the housework and childcare, and thus reduce fertility more and increase their employment less. I will build on these insights and explain why some countries move from A to B and some move from A to C. My answer is going to be that economic advances, such as income increases and urbanization and educational change, may be so rapid that there is too little time for generations to fully adjust to an altered structure of household and market production. Thus, the rate of growth of the macroeconomy has effects on microeconomic decisions. So let me take these ideas to the data, and I'm going to use two groups of countries. The first includes the US, UK, France, Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. Call these group one. They are currently countries with moderate total fertility rates, although all currently less than 2, as was just pointed out. Group 2 includes Spain, Portugal, Greece, Japan, and Korea. And they are countries with currently very low fertility, most of them below 1.3 and famously 1 below 1. So let's look at first at the post-World War II fertility histories of each of these groups of countries. Consider first Group 1 nations, and first note, of course, the post-World War II baby booms in almost all of the combatant countries, but the extraordinary baby boom in the United States, which brought me here. And then the great declines, so that around 1980, fertility in all 6 nations had become less than 2. Group 2 nations are mainly latecomers to economic development, and fertility levels began extremely high, especially for Korea and Japan, although these countries had very different levels before 1980. Their fertility rates are very similar after. Now put a few of these nations in the 2 groups on the same graph for the post-1970 period, with Group 2 in orange and Group 1 in blue. Group 2 in orange had high total fertility in the 1970s, but now extremely low. And Group 1 began lower, but is now higher than Group 2. So what explains, as I said, the collapse of fertility, especially among Group 2 nations? And the reason that I'm going to emphasize concerns the sudden and rapid economic growth among Group 2 nations that produced what I term gendered and generational conflicts. In contrast, Group 1 nations had more continuous economic growth, and generational conflict was minimized. Consider first a simple model of the conflict. Assume a series of male and female cohorts at birth all inherit a set of traditions and beliefs. These inherited values form a fertility preference that's carried with them over their lifetimes. But when individuals reach adulthood, let's call that 20 years old, the person also forms a fertility preference that depends only on their current conditions. The current level of economic development will determine whether the person will want to raise a family, pursue a career, or do a bit of both. The 2 fertility preferences, the one that's inherited and the one that is formed as an adult, then get aggregated. At age 20, in my model, all form opposite sex couples. That's just my model. They marry, they decide on their number of births, given both their inherited traditions and their current desires. More formally, men and women decide how many children each would like to have, given here by F sub I, for the fertility preferences of cohort I. since each person has two influences on I, one that is inherited, that's beta 0, and one that is formed by current circumstances, that's beta 20. These will need to be weighted in some manner. And a key assumption is that males put more weight, that's the alpha, on their inherited traditions than do females, who put more weight on the economic conditions when they're 20 years old. I think of the alphas as representing a generational conflict. To make this simple, fertility decisions in this simple model will depend only on the level of income that's negatively taking the ratio of equation 1 to 2 and substituting gives us 3. Greater economic growth, that's the ratio of the small y's, will increase the ratio of male to female desired fertility and create conflict. Similarly, an increase in the difference between the male and female attachment to the past, the difference in the alphas, will also increase the fertility conflict of the couple. Both can be thought in this context as generational conflict, as long as economic growth occurs from the parental to the children's cohorts, that is from age 0 here to age 20 of the children. And given that alpha M is less than alpha F, women will have a lower value of F than will men. But some number of children must be produced, even if it's 0, and preferences must be aggregated. And I assume that the number of children the couple have, F sub 20, is determined by the value of a parameter called lambda between 0 and 1, which represents the sharing of household and caring time. The greater is sharing, the closer lambda will be to 1, and the more women will go along with the higher fertility wishes of their husbands. Lambda thus gives us the degree of gender conflict. This brings up the macroeconomy and thus to the rate of growth of GDP per capita. For Group 1 nations, despite substantial volatility in the pre-1950s period, Group 1 nations had fairly steady increases in GDP per capita for the long period. But Group 2 nations did not. Rather, they mainly had economic stagnation, collapse until the 1950s, and then extremely rapid catch-up in the post-World War II decades up until the late 1990s to early 2000s. Generations of parents and grandparents who had spent their lives in rural areas and had low levels of education and income had children who would live in cities, be more educated. The differences were enormously large. Evidence on differences in unpaid work hours in the home between men and women supports this notion that the countries I've identified as having sudden and rapid growth were also the ones with an excess number of hours worked by women in unpaid household and care work relative to those worked by men. The horizontal axis is the difference in unpaid household and care hours per day between the average male and female by country, and it's graphed against total fertility rate. The two sets of nations clearly group by work sharing arrangements. So in conclusion, I've shown that changes in birth rates have been nearly ubiquitous. I've emphasized that they are often due to macroeconomic changes. Rapid economic change often challenges strongly held beliefs, and beliefs change more slowly than economies do. Traditional people are catapulted into modernity. Women often have more to gain from modernity than do men. Rapid economic change can lead to reductions in total fertility rates due to generational and gendered conflicts, especially when women's educational and employment are unconstrained. And the babies, thank you.
Okay, I'll keep the babies up. So I think yeah. So Claudia gave a very good idea of how the macroeconomy can influence fertility. I'm going to try to go to heterogeneous agents model and try to see if we go dig a little bit deeper into who's having babies, we can learn a little bit more about the causes. But you know, when I was writing this, every time, you know, the press talks about low fertility, they're not talking about economic growth. They're not talking about even the maternity cost. They're talking about environmental wishes of new parents to reduce population growth, the cost of diapers, that's a typical thing that the press, you know, mentions, or even pension systems as not requiring babies because now, you know, the government pays for your pension. And I think that quantitatively, although this is a room full of people who know better than me how to put quantitative figures over models, I think that these are relatively small compared to the opportunity cost of having a baby, and that's wages. And so what I'm going to mostly look at is differences between women and men depending on their opportunity cost. And one of the things that has happened over the 20th century is a huge change in who are the mothers in the world, and in particular in the developed world. I remember I bought this book for my daughter when she was little. It was 100 famous female scientists over the world. And one of the very depressing things that was about that book was that none of them had families. And the few that were married had basically their scientific progress had been stolen by their husband. That was, you know, the few ones that were there. And so I think Claudia says it in the book, you know, originally women had to pick between family and a career. And this has completely changed. Today, there's more marriage among college graduated women than non-college graduated women. And in our article with Aloysius Xiao and Laura Salisbury, we show or we argue that this is actually a demand and not a supply story, i.e., high-skilled women are now more desired and more valued as wives and mothers than before. And how can we reconcile this with decreasing fertility is we have a change in how much input we put in each children instead of how many children we have. And once you start caring about how far your 1 or 2 or 3 children are going to go, then you care a whole lot about the parental input. A big question is, why do we care more about the mother's input than the father's input? Because the demand for high-skilled women as partners is as high by low-skilled men than high-skilled men. So somehow this is not symmetric. But this is very, very important to understand, that if we're switching to caring more about the education of the mother, and that mother faces a higher opportunity cost of having children, you're you know, it's going to go hand in hand that you're going to see a decrease in fertility. And then the second thing that is important to understand is that high-skilled women have decreased their fertility less than low-skilled women over this period. So high-skilled women always have fewer children than low-skilled women, but low-skilled women used to have a lot of children, and this gap is getting almost closed, at least in the US and in many other settings. And it's getting closed not at age 20, not at age 30, it's getting closed at age 40. So a big difference between low skill and high skill mothers is when do they become mothers. And the delay in fertility has been particularly strong for high skilled women who now have their children in their late 30s instead of their late 20s in previous periods. And so, as I said, this is likely to be due to a shift from quantity to quality and a care for the input of these high-skilled women. So I think that it's very important when we think of the macroeconomic consequences of lower fertility to not treat the TFR as just a one number, but we're also potentially changing who are these children and what type of families they are born. And I'll come back a little bit more to that. Claudia also emphasized something extremely important, that fertility is not a one-person decision, although, with AI, and it can become a little bit more a one-person decision, but traditionally we need two people to make a baby. And the fertility intentions of men and women in a variety of work by Matthias Dubke and Michel Turtil has been shown to differ substantially and not random. So in circumstances where men and women share more equally housework, these fertility decisions tend to be more aligned than when the burden is more on one partner. And so this is quite important when we think of fertility and why it's decreasing, because if it's a situation where men and women do not have the same plans and the same objectives, then how do they negotiate this is going to be quite relevant. There's a variety of policy ideas, such as child care subsidies or policies to reduce the burden more on women than men, to try to see if this can play a role. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the fact that we have experienced, and not just in rich countries, a very strong decoupling of fertility and marriage. So many of you might think that I'm talking about France or the Nordic countries. The country that has the highest out-of-wedlock birth in the world is actually the country where I live, Chile, where that number was 0 in 1980. There was no out-of-wedlock birth in 1980, and today there's 70% of babies who are born to parents who are unmarried. And we might not care about marriage, we might just think that it's equivalent to cohabitation, but that does not really translate in the same way, in the sense that it's not just that in Chile, there's more two non-married parents living together who have these babies. The single motherhood is about 30%. So out of that 70%, there might be around 40% of these parents, or 50, and then that number starts dwindling over time. But we have about 30% of children who are living in single-parent household. So again, when we're thinking about replacement rate, the macroeconomic consequence, it's going to be very different if we're thinking of children who are living with two parents with that support, compared to one where typically the low-income spouse is the one who is raising that child. Okay, and so in research that I've done with Corinne Lowe, one thing that we emphasize is that marriage may matter for all this discussion, and not on a religious or moral ground, but rather that if we think that fertility is coming down because children are costly, and the cost tends to be borne more by one or another parent and not so equally, then the protection that this parent that makes this investment receives is very, very important. And that parent is going to be unwilling to make that investment unless they feel that they're protected somehow if the relationship breaks down and if they have to, for example, face the fact that their human capital has depreciated during the time that they've devoted to their children. And so marriage is not a foolproof bullet, actually, in all the world, including in South America, where marriage rates have completely collapsed. Marriage is getting less and less protective. So it's not really that people are not wanting to get married because marriage is too demanding. It's actually that they don't care about getting married because marriage is not really offering them anything more than cohabitation. Divorce is unilateral in almost all countries in the world, and parental rights to non-married partners is now also almost universal. So what do I get from marriage? And what we show with Corinne is one of the few things that is still relevant for marriage in the US is asset sharing. And surprise, surprise, whom still marries in the US? People with assets. So people who seek marriage are actually the ones for whom getting out of marriage is costly. And so why would that be the case? It's because you want commitment. And why do you want commitment? Because you want to offer that protection to the spouse who will make the investment. So we show that if you when you get married, you face circumstances where assets are going to be less available, and you're going to have more trouble making your marriage very enforceable, then you're less likely to specialize, you're less likely to have children, and you're less likely to remain married. So overall, I think that all I'm trying to emphasize is that the decline in fertility has not been the same for everybody. We really have a world where low-skilled women have much fewer kids than before. They continue to have them a little bit earlier and mostly outside of marriage. While high-skilled women have had a fall, but not as much as the low-skilled women, they have very strong delays in fertility and the age at which they start having children. And this is the group where they continue to have some of their children within marriage. And so I think that this can help us think of policy remedies if for that, I'm sure is going to be a topic for the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So, oops, let me get this started. Okay, very good. So let me start with a simple yet powerful accounting identity. The growth rate of output is equal to the growth rate of labor productivity plus the growth rate of the labor force. Now, how do we define the labor force? Doesn't really matter for what I'm going to say today. We can measure it in total number of workers, or the total number of hours work, or the total number of adults in an age working group. It's actually going to give us exactly the same results. So think about your average advanced economy around 1965. You have a 2% growth on average on labor productivity. That's kind of the long run average of the US economy, and a 1% growth of the labor force. That tells you that on an average year, you are going to grow 3%. You know, some years are a little bit higher, some years are a little bit lower. Now, let's fast forward, and instead of thinking about an average economy in the 1960s, we are thinking about Japan right now. Let's imagine that Japan is still able to keep a 2% growth of labor productivity, which is a heroic assumption with a very aged society. But, you know, I want to give myself the most cautious scenario. Japan labor force is falling now around 1% a year. It means that Japan on an average year is going to grow 1%. That's it. Okay, so there has been thousands of papers, dozens of books written about Japanization and the problems of Japan. I have been in this room discussing some of these papers. There is nothing to it. I'm going to quote you some numbers from a paper I recently published, The Wealth of Working Nations. So between 1990 and 2019, the US grew 2.58% a year, total output. And Japan grew 0.83. And this is kind of the motivation that we always have for the problems of Japan, 1.7% a year of difference. But if you measure in the number of workers, you will see that the difference goes, the US goes down to 1.65 and Japan grows all the way up to 1.39. Suddenly you have a very tiny difference. Drop from the sample, the early 1990s when Japan was digesting the real estate bubble. Actually, Japan has been doing better than the US since around 1995. There are just fewer Japanese. That's it. Okay. Now, when I get to this point and I'm giving this type of talks, I always have someone who asks, hey, but don't we care about GDP per capita? Yes and no. Yes, we care about GDP per capita because that gives us a sense of the amount of goods and services in an economy. But there are a lot of things that do not depend on GDP per capita. One, paying for public debt. Okay, you have an amount of public debt and someone needs to pay for it. Whether or not there is a lot of Japanese or fewer Japanese, that doesn't really matter. Second, national defense, tying back with Mateo's presentation early this morning. If you think as a country that you need so many aircraft carrier task groups, you need to pay for those. Whether or not there are fewer or more Japanese, that doesn't really matter. And third, there is a subtle point that people tend to forget. Yes, GDP per capita may still be growing, but if a lot of people is retired, we somehow need to transfer resources from those working to those not working. And the only way we know how to do that is through taxation. And taxation creates distortions. And the amount of distortions that you are going to create are going to be absolutely humongous. And I'm not talking here about absolutely, things that are hard to think. No. Let me give you a very concrete example. So I just brought this winter a book on Spanish public finances. And I'm going to cite this example of Spain because one, since I brought the book, I have them fresh in my head. But second, because in some sense, Spain is like the US will look like in 20 or 25 years in terms of the demographic transition. Okay, so in 27, right before the financial crisis, the total government spending was around 39% of GDP, okay? And here I'm looking from the last township to the national government. In 2024, government spending was 45% of GDP. How much of this 6%, the 6 points increase comes from pensions and other costs associated with aging? 120%. Okay? If you take out what we pay to social security payments and everything related with it, we also have like a very generous, care at home program and things like that. All the Spanish government is spending less on everything else. That means, for instance, right now in Spain, like in many countries in Europe, one of the main political issues is housing. Housing has got really very, very expensive, and people are saying, why don't we set up a public housing program? The answer, there is no money. There's just absolutely no money on the budget for it. National defense, again, going back to Mateo's point this morning, Spain, like many other countries, has committed to increase its national defense to 2% of GDP. There is no money for it. Absolutely everything goes to social security payments. And the problem is to keep the social security payments and keep the promises, we will need to keep increasing more and more and more and more and more all the other taxes. So it's just not about income per capita and GDP per capita. It's about the redistribution of that GDP per capita. And people constantly think about this. Okay, so let me change tack a little bit. Let me switch gears. I get a lot of phone calls from media and journalists. And one of the typical questions that they always ask me is, well, you're probably worried about this fertility issue because, you are European and you don't like, people maybe from other countries coming to the US or to Europe, but this is not a big deal for the planet. And my answer is, You think that the fiscal problems that the US faces are serious? You think that the fiscal problems that Spain faces are serious? No. The fiscal problems that Brazil, that Guatemala, that Chile face in the middle run are an order of magnitude worse. I'm going to give you a simple test. I'm going to give you 4 countries, and you're going to tell me which one do you think has the highest fertility rate? Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, and Japan. Japan has the highest fertility rate. Okay? Chile in 2024, maybe the first country, we don't have the final numbers. We only have birth data. Birth needs to be transformed into fertility. It requires a little bit of work. But I have done some preliminary calculations. Chile may be the first country outside East Asia that breaks the barrier of 1.0. If I were the Minister of Finance in Chile, I could not sleep at night thinking about this. Say, well, Chile, middle income country, it should be okay. Okay, let me tell you another country. And again, I don't know why I'm mentioning Mateo that much today. I hope he will be pleased with me. He mentioned the United Fruit Company and the US coups. One of the nastiest things that the US ever did was the coup in Guatemala in 1954. There is a great novel, if any of you read Spanish, Tiempos Recios, about that. Guatemala broke in 2024 below replacement rate. Okay? Guatemala has gone in around 20 years from being a country that had the fertility of your average sub-Saharan country, 3.8, 3.9, to 2.0. Guatemala is not rich. Guatemala is not growing. And yet, the fertility is falling faster than anything I have ever seen on the data. I have another paper where I have tried to put data on demographic transitions for the last 300 years. No one is dropping as fast as Guatemala ever. Now, Spain, we can bring people. Basically, the reason Spain is working right now is because we bring a lot of Colombians and Argentinians and Mexicans who is going to migrate into Guatemala. And I'm sorry if any of you loves Guatemala, okay? Guatemala is just not going to be able to attract immigrants. How is Guatemala? No, but you brought someone from Honduras. You actually made the problem of Honduras worse. Very good. You are part of the problem. Okay? How are these countries going to handle getting old and having these amazingly low fertility rates, being poor, and in addition to it, having out-migration? Now, I have been using a lot of examples from Latin America, because I have a project on fertility in Latin America. But when I'm giving this talk in Spain, a lot of people, of course, you know, we have a lot of problems with immigration from Morocco. I already remind them, Morocco is at 1.9 already. Yes, there is a lot of immigrants coming from Morocco to Spain now, but they are 20 years old. They were the kids born in Morocco in 2005. They are not the kids being born in Morocco right now. Okay? And this is going to completely change the world, because in 20 years, in 25 years, how is Morocco going to be able to run their country with these extremely low fertility rates? Let me just wrap up in the last minute and 15 seconds that I have left. I'm working these days a little bit with the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, and the numbers we are seeing over there for East Europe are amazing. It's really incredible. I was just looking at data from Moldova. I was looking at data from Bulgaria. I was looking at data from Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, there's not going to be anyone left in Bosnia in like 50 years. So, you know, no more problems over there. But the point, really, the fundamental point is, if you think this is about the US, you are mistaken. The US is having a mild issue of fertility drop. If you think this is about Italy and Spain and Greece, we kind of have a little bit of a problem. No. The problem is how in the world Colombia and Chile and Tunisia and Iran and Turkey are going to be able to do these things. And We don't have very good data from Africa, but if I were a betting man, I think that the speed at which this is going to happen in Africa is going to be amazing. And then in 2040, we are going to have conferences on the collapse of fertility in Africa and the consequences. And I finish right in time, John, as promised.
Oh, oh.
Okay, we are going to do like a state dinner. I can see that.
Okay, so
This is this, Claudia.
no. Let me just lead off with one question. There's so many came up with all the presentations, but to what extent is there a free rider of social insurance? So suppose that Doge decided that to cut the budget deficit, they were going to get rid of Social Security, and then obviously we can't do very much right now, but what impact would that have on future generations in terms of their decisions?
One of my colleagues loves to say that Social Security is just a change from relying on your own children to relying on everybody else's children. So you always have to rely on the next generation, you know, whether you have a bond to them or not is what Social Security. I think that that has been discussed a lot in the case of China. And my sense is that it's still tough to trust your children as suitable providers of social insurance. So my own feeling of this limited literature is that it's not a huge determinant, but clearly it's not null either, right? It matters, but I don't think it's a huge thing that parents are thinking of very, in particular, because now it's not your children who will probably offer care, it's your grandchildren, given our current age.
But historically it was, we know that. People had large numbers of children to have a certain number that survived. The difference is that we live longer. We get sicker, we live a lot more.
So I think that the main difference is the presence of financial markets. And so actually Larry Jones and Shelter Hill have a very nice paper on this. Basically what they argue
is I'm a farmer in the middle of France, 1720. Maybe the only way I can save is to my kids. Today I can buy stocks and bonds. So in that sense, it has a bit of an effect. There is actually a paper, I was trying to remember the name of the two authors. They exploited a change in the retirement rules in Italy, where if you were born like in December, you had a more generous pension than if you were born in January. And they show a little bit of an effect on fertility, but not much.
I was intrigued by so I had sort of two thoughts that came to mind that interacted with what I did. So first of all, does culture change more quickly among the educated? And then the second thing is, can upheavals like World War II or other examples that change norms more quickly?
Well, I think one of the issues is whose culture. And so my point was that women change because modernity is offering them something big. And modernity for perhaps one generation or two generations is taking something away from them. So I'm not certain I want to call that culture.
Well, the evidence we have from studies, for example, that Fernandez has done shows that even when you move, you tend to keep the culture of your own country, and you transmit that to the next generation. So I do think that the rate at which culture is changing tends to be slower than many other elements. I think that we are facing a situation where the economic opportunity cost of men and women are much more equal than cultural norms about what they should do at home. And that has been I think it's very relevant in trying to understand the fertility pattern. Because if women continue to do 60–80% of not just childcare related tasks, but housework, then that's definitely something that will influence them.
In one of the talks, someone mentioned an extraordinarily important part of this, which is not culture. It's the law. And it's the way in which we commit to each other and how we enforce that commitment. That's really the question. So if women have a child, they then become responsible for the care of the child unless there's commitment. And therefore, if there's no ex-ante commitment, then they might not want to have the child. So I think that solving this contract problem, solving this commitment problem is absolutely key. I think that was part of her comments.
I'm trying to say something insidious, which is that I think we have very long way to go before we understand the broad causes of global fertility. That's not to say that any particular econometric study that finds stars in a well-identified regression is wrong, but I really wonder about the external validity, the explanatory power of these.
low fertility is a globally convergent phenomenon. And whatever was happening in the late 20th century in the United States, it just isn't exactly what's happening in the last decade to drive birth rates. India is a place where most women don't work outside the home, where marriage is basically universal. So like the kind of explanations that we hear in the United States, not necessarily sort of like the loose explanations you hear like in popular media, aren't getting married anymore. This is about women's labor force opportunities. Housing is too expensive. I'm worried about the environment. These things just cannot explain cross-country conversions. Not only do most women in India not live outside the home, but marriage is basically universal. Everyone gets married by age 20, has 1 or 2 kids in the early 20s, and then opts for sterilization. So there is just like there are very different patterns of behavior around the world, and we are far from having a universal theory of fertility decline that maps to all the variables.
Yeah, no, so I fully agree. So I went to Minnesota, I studied my rational choice. I even wrote several papers on the Farrow-Becker quality-quantity trade-off. I was the strongest believer in the quality-quantity trade-off until around 5 years ago. And can I use the standard quantity-quality trade-off model to account for what has happened in Chile? No. I mean, I can torture the data and I can, come up with an elasticity crazy thing. I just cannot get it to work. And I actually try really hard, and I just cannot come up. Yeah.
What's the fertility of high?
That, unfortunately, I don't know from the top of my head, but my suspicion is, that there is not that much difference across educational levels.
And it's a little bit lower.
And it's a little bit lower, yeah. Yeah, because what I know, for instance, in the case of Colombia, is that Bogota, which is the main metropolitan area where the most educated people are, DANE estimated last year that Bogota fertility rate was 0.9. And in Mexico, the CONAPO, the Consejo Nacional de la Población, estimates that now the fertility rate in Mexico, Distrito Federal, is 0.95. This is lower than LA. It's really mind-blowing.
Can you tell me why the UN data is so off? This, if anyone here can look up total fertility in Colombia, and you'll see it's 1.69.
Yeah.
But it's not. So
Oh,
somehow, the UN thinks that there are babies, or it thinks that there aren't adults, one or the other.
So I actually have given a couple of presentations that are online. If anyone wants them, I can send you the link to the video and I can send you my slides. The United Nations numbers are just crazy, absolutely crazy.
Okay, well, that's an answer.
Okay, second answer. Let's see how far I can go with this answer. I have reasons to believe that demographers at the United Nations agree with this statement. The United Nations faces a serious political economic problem. Basically, they have been saying for 50 years that the world population is exploding, that we have a huge problem, and now they need to completely change the messaging. So what they are doing is, in every new release of the world population prospect, they are kind of lowering like 200 million people year by year. And they are kind of fine-tuning what they are doing year by year.
So, but are all the countries wrong? They can't all be wrong.
Okay, so of course, for countries like the US,
They can't lie.
no, they can lie. But by the way, there is one country that the United Nations 100% agrees with official statistics to the last digit. Anyone can guess which one?
Greenland.
Vatican.
China. The United Nations 100% believes China's numbers. But in the case of Colombia, I can show you the slides later, Claudia, but the United Nations says that last year there were 750,000 people born in Colombia. People at DANE, they tell me it's 458,000. I talk with them. We have a meeting. Eh? No, with the statisticians, with the people who are building the census, and they tell me there is no way 750,000 people were born. So we may have undercounted a little bit, probably not. No one understands what these numbers from the United Nations show. And if you want later, I will show you some of the United Nations numbers. Just to give you a very simple example, the United Nations computes there is net migration into the planet. I'm willing to take the bet that that's not the case. The United Nations numbers are absolutely 100% crazy. They don't make any sense whatsoever. They don't make any sense whatsoever. Sorry to be a little bit forceful.
All right. Go ahead.
Gone late. Do I have to redo my intermediate macro notes? Because I just got done with the solo model. And the solo model, that population growth is a bad thing, right? It prevents capital accumulation. But I haven't heard, is that just small relative to all of these things? I mean, or is there some sort of a dividend there?
So.
The housing problem,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Parking.
Also building houses could help there. I am one of maybe just two microeconomists in here, but from my outside view, it just simply be true that more people are more problems given just the historic.
The argument in solo is you have to outfit with capital all the new people. And so if you have a lot of new people, it's costly to outfit them with capital. Fewer new people means you have higher quality. That's the quality quality trade-off. Yes, that's
Not exactly. That's not the call.
The only thing I would say is that it's very different from going from 2.5 to 2.2. That's slower population growth. It's very different to have a absence of a steady state because we have population decreasing every year. And I think that that puts us in different territory, at least in terms.
so it's to decline.
Yes.
That is the issue.
Yeah, and just channeling Jones here for a while. Think about some type of endogenous growth model where people create ideas. There is a beautiful paper by Hugo Hoppenheim, and I apologize to the two co-authors, I don't remember their names, in Econometrica, where Hugo has a very simple exercise. He looks at the amount of firms in the US and new entrants, and he says, actually, conditional on being 23 years old, people assess entrepreneurial 30 years ago. There are just fewer 23 years old. So there are fewer new firms. And he basically has a generally model where the full distribution of firms changes has huge consequences.
Thank you. David Weil from Brown University. I have a lot to say about a lot of these things, but I'll restrict myself. Although I will mention that the answer to John Leahy's question is in my 1997 handbook chapter on aging. All the math is there, much of it which is ripped off from a Cutler, Paterba, Shaner, and Summers paper. I want to focus on sort of two things that Mike Geruso said, although as I said, there's a lot of interesting things that were said. One is about this idea of, convergence to a universal low fertility. And I think that's a really fascinating idea. But I'd love to discuss it more, but I don't think I agree with it, in part because when I look at sort of the different low fertility countries in the world, there just seems to be so much heterogeneity. So one thing that was not brought up here at all is the East Asian super low fertility clearly has a lot to do with insane levels of child investment. And, a kind of arms race of getting your kid into one of the best 3 universities in Korea, and starting with, tutoring when they're 5 and so on. And that's not to say these gender issues aren't important and so on, but, I think there's many things that push fertility down in many different places. I could give you a long rant about why we shouldn't focus on 2 as a particularly interesting number. And so I kind of take the other side of the universality of what you're saying. The other question I want to put on the table, and again, I'm going to use Mike as the hook for this, is I think there are really kind of 2 questions that people have in their mind when they think about whether low fertility is a problem. One is the one that is a really NBER question, is kind of what are the macro consequences of this in terms of stuff we can understand, like income per capita. So yes, you can throw your Chad Jones on the table. I can throw my environmentalism on the table. We can talk about housing investment. We can talk about, I think, the most important thing, which is how distortionary are the taxes that pay for old age pensions. And if you, raise the marginal cost of public funds enough, then aging population is going to be super bad. And we can kind of have that whole discussion. And I think that's a great thing to do. I don't think that if you do that, you're going to get that sort of below replacement fertility, even fertility of 1 child per woman, is a macro disaster. We can talk about what a disaster would be, but I think maybe that's going to lower steady state consumption, 10% or 20% below what it was going to be over a very long run. And that doesn't seem terrible to me. I think you and I are both sympathetic to the idea that there's another set of problems, and I'm not thinking of kind of national defense and stuff. I'm thinking about what are we trying to maximize in our social welfare function? And I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that we should be caring about the potential utility of people who don't get to live in a low fertility society. Unlike the other stuff that I mentioned, that's a kind of very non-NBER thing. That's like a philosophical problem. But I think when you dig, that's really, a lot of us, who think about this, kind of have these conversations about like, what's the world going to be like when population is falling by half every generation, and there's going to be less art and less music and so on. But I think it's really in the end about these kind of unlived lives and their welfare that is something we have to take seriously.
Thank you. Actually, there is an NBR paper we had at the EFG program on evaluating the number of people by Chad Jones and people, so everything's an NBR question these days. Tip Jim. But the question I had for the panel was about birth control. And so that was barely mentioned in describing why fertility had come down. And I would have guessed, I couldn't find, ChatGPT couldn't find data for me quickly enough, but that the price and the availability of birth control has come down pretty much. I mean, time series, we're not supposed to regress things with trends on things with trends, but those trends must move together. And it comes also into contact with some of the discussion of the panel about the role of preferences. And if birth control has been important, you might think that people have always wanted to have fewer kids. They just haven't been able to do that until the price of having fewer kids came down. So I wanted to ask about the importance of that.
Extremely good question. Historically, though, fertility came tumbling down in the U.S. before modern contraceptive methods. In fact, before people really had a very good understanding of the physiology of contraception itself. That's pretty amazing. And we know that it came down through a desire because it came down from the age of the woman at her last child. Okay, not the age of the first. It wasn't that they were putting off having kids. So, but birth control is certainly extremely important. And as we heard before from someone, the fraction of women who are sterilized and of men who are sterilized worldwide is enormous. So there is a great demand for security in birth control. Anyone else?
think, you know, one way to see, at least in the United States context, which it's somewhat familiar with, that birth control just is not as important as individual people's lives, and it matters a lot whether you're having a child when you want one rather than when you don't want one, and not having one later if that's what you want. In terms of its impacts on birth rates, you know, it wasn't, you know, we were the US over the 80s, 90s, most of the 2000s, hovering around to give birth to. And then since the Great Recession, US fertility rates dropped as low as 0.1. But we didn't drop starting in 2009 because there was some new access to birth control that Americans gained that they hadn't had for the last 3 decades. We were holding, you know, at that birth rate for 3 decades, you know, without changing in access to birth control. So I think, like, it's important in individual people's lives, it's important timing. It may play a particularly important role in places that have come down from high fertility to lower fertility. It might be a really important thing about explaining the difference between 4 and 3 children. I think, you know, it's probably not the thing that explains the difference between why Texas is at 1.8 and Massachusetts is at 1.4, or why, you know, France is at 1.6 and it was.
To be clear, that's what I had in mind. It was the global dimension of this, and more so than the 1.4 versus 1.6 in the US, but some of the large.
It's teen birth rates. Teen birth rates have plummeted. We really do care, as been mentioned many times by people on the panel, who has births and whether these are wanted children. Teen birth rates have absolutely plummeted. And oddly, they haven't plummeted because of LARCs, because of long-acting contraception. They've actually plummeted, believe it or not, all you parents, because teens are having less sex. I know you don't believe it. But take it from the UN. No. Someone's having less sex.
And that's not just in the US, but the teen births even in poorer countries, for example, in all the Latin American countries that Jesus was referring to, there is a big fall in fertility and also a reduction in teen births. It's still hot, but so you might be able to affect the timing thanks to access or social norms changing and making teens, when they do have sex, to have access to proper contraceptive. I was also going to say that in some countries, this has a role in making the fertility of spouses more aligned. So if the women can hide her use of fertility, she might be able to have more of a control over her. Yes, sorry, contraception.
I think there's a whole thing. So this decline in fertility. But is there any exception to that? No. At least some countries, they saw the decline, but at some point they might stabilize one way or another. Second question to Sus, since UN is also which should, based on the fertility rates, at least in part,
Okay. So let me start with I just opened the slides. I gave this presentation at the demography group at Penn the other day. Okay, so in 2015, the United Nations was forecasting that in the year 2100, we will be 11.2 billion and growing. In 2017, they were saying we will still be growing 11.1. In 2019, we will still be growing 10.8. 2022, no, we will not be growing. We will peak at 2086 with 10.4. In 2024, they say that we are going to peak in 2084 with 10.2. So they have basically taken out 1 billion people in 9 years. Now, remember that this looks good for the United Nations. And the reason is they are focusing on a stock, not on a flow. If you actually change, you were going to report this in the flows, they are changing their flows of births in a dramatic way every 2 years. But they really try to do their very best for no one to notice it from year to year. In fact, what they did this year, so they cannot look like it's too terrible, is for some reason, they decided there are going to be 31 more million Ethiopians, 31 more million people in Yemen, 27 more people in Bangladesh, and 18 more million people in Uzbekistan in the year 2000. Because otherwise, instead of the world population peaking in 2084, they will need to have accepted what's going to be in the early 70s. And they really don't want to say.
I don't understand why.
No, because Claudia, they have spent 50 years saying the world population is exploding.
Okay.
So the first question.
Let me try to answer one of the questions that was raised, which is really very important. Have we ever seen a moment when, I'll make it even more extreme, have we ever seen a moment when a country dipped below, and I don't want to say anything about the magical number 2 because difficult ceiling, dipped below, let's say 2, and then came way back up? And the answer is, and how? We have. And we saw it lasted for a very long time. And we still don't understand why. Yeah.
I want to jump in. So there we're talking about period fertility rates, but let's talk about completed cohort fertility, the number that a given woman has or a cohort woman has over her lifetime, which is going to, if it's after World War II, everyone's feeling optimistic and people of all ages are getting pregnant where they weren't before. That's going to show up in a period fertility rate that could be shifting forward, the births that would happen later, and finally having births that would go through. But if we look at cohort level of fertility in the nations that have good enough data that the Human Fertility Database reports accumulating that cohort fertility data, there have been something like 26 countries where completed cohort fertility by age 45 or 50 has ever dipped below 1.1. In 0 of those 26 countries has completed cohort fertility ever increased again above 2. So I see that I think 2 is a magic number, and so I'm orienting this towards that. But the data from cohorts does not give us this. We're looking at the actual number of children that a woman had, rather than sort of squishing together cohort effects, time period effects, age effects in these period fertility rates, which are generally useful, but they become less and less useful during times when there's baby. So I am much less.
Are you sure that because the U.S. had 10 years of depression and then more than 10 years of depression, there has to be a cohort. There have to be cohorts that.
None of the countries in the HFD.
I'm only talking about the United States. It's the only country I know about. The only country I care about.
But we should care about.
No.
But
you said no country.
Yes,
and I can't believe. Oh, okay.
I was just going to say that although I don't know of any examples that have reverted, I think we do have some notions that many of the type of policies that are implemented to try to revert it are probably not working. So the typical baby bonus is not, you would have to put so much money on the table. And when you do that, you target a group of people that is not necessarily the ones that you want them to have children. And sorry for being, but I think that childcare has been probably the best, so offering subsidized or free high quality childcare is probably one of the policies that is likely to move the needle, but probably not enough.
So let me, I promise I'm very fast. I think we need to keep in mind also, even if you don't recover all the way back to 2, you stabilize at 1.5. This is a very different situation than falling all the way That's the only thing.
All right, well, this is a fascinating conversation panel. I want to thank panelists and then all the good questions.